At 12 minutes past 6 in the morning, a diesel engine was eating my fence, and I stood on my back porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and watched a Bobcat skid steer take the first of my 3 century oaks off at the root like it was a weed. A man in a reflective vest saw me and didn't even throttle down. He just pointed at a tablet clamped to the machine and shouted over the engine, "Approved community trail, sir. Take it up with the board." My name is Owen Mercer. I was 48 that year, and I have spent 25 years as a licensed land surveyor and, before that, a title agent, which means I read plats and deeds the way other men read the morning paper. A trail that did not exist yesterday, and a piece of paper they had just, very unwisely, waved at the one surveyor on the street. I did not run down there and grab the machine. I put the coffee down, took out my phone, and started filming, wide and steady, letting the timestamp and the GPS tag do what my temper wanted to do. Because the thing about a man with a Bobcat and no idea who he's dealing with is that he will happily record his own confession if you let him. Then I looked past my own torn-up yard and saw the thing that changed the whole shape of it. The line the machine was cutting didn't stop at my property. It ran straight down the back of the entire street, a raw brown scar chewing toward my neighbor's fences, a greenbelt trail plowing through the private backyards of 11 households who had also, presumably, not been asked. This was not about me. And when I walked back inside, there was already a notice wedged in my front door, a fine from the Hollow Creek Architectural Committee for $200, citing me for obstructing access to a community amenity. They had bulldozed my land and fined me for standing on it. I have to admit, I laughed. The short, ugly laugh you laugh when someone hands you your own evidence gift-wrapped. I went out and stood on my own dirt, directly in the path of the ripper. And the machine stopped because the alternative was a felony the operator didn't want. That's when the first police call happened, and it wasn't mine. Gwen Tolliver, 57, president of the Hollow Creek Board, came marching down the easement in a quilted vest with a clipboard and her phone all ready to her ear, and I heard her tell a 911 dispatcher that a resident is physically obstructing approved community work. 2 things about that call. It was false and it was recorded, both by me and by the county's computer-aided dispatch system, which timestamps every word whether Gwen wants it to or not. A deputy rolled up 10 minutes later, a tired young guy who plainly wanted to be anywhere else, and I made it easy for him. I laid the recorded plat on the hood of his cruiser, then the county GIS parcel map, then my own deed, and I showed him the property line the trail was crossing. He read all 3, looked at the scar in my yard, and told Gwen Tolliver this was a civil property matter and that the work needed to hold until it was sorted. The foreman grinned at me as he loaded up and said, "We'll be back with the paper that moves you." The race, I understood right then, had already started. Their next move was to try to own my driveway. By that afternoon, the board had stood up what Gwen proudly called a trail patrol, which turned out to be 2 retirees in orange vests who parked a pickup nose to nose across my ranch access and started photographing my truck and anyone who came to my door. I have learned, mostly the hard way, that you never lay a hand on a person or a vehicle when a camera is running, because the instant you do, you become the story. So I didn't push the truck. I photographed the plate, I photographed the vests, and then I called a tow company, because that pickup was parked across a private access easement recorded in my name, and I stood in my own driveway sipping a fresh coffee while 2 very surprised men in orange watched their truck get winched up and hauled off. One of them called the sheriff on me. The same tired deputy came back, looked at the recorded easement, and explained to the trail patrol the legal difference between your community and this man's driveway. It was shaping up to be a long week for everyone in a reflective vest. They came back at dawn, of course, because Gwen had told her contractor to finish the Mercer stretch by the weekend while the lawyers are asleep, a sentence I would later get to read out loud in a room full of her neighbors. This time, the call to 911 was mine. I reported an active crime in progress, criminal damage to property, and trespass,
a crew grading private land with no order I'd ever been shown. When the deputy arrived, he did the one thing the board could not survive, which is that he asked the foreman to produce the paper. And the foreman, God bless his honesty, shrugged and said, "We were just sent here, man. Take it up with the HOA." On camera, on the CAD log, a crew destroying private property who could not name a single legal document authorizing it. Gwen arrived mid-scene, furious, and made it worse the way people like Gwen always do, leaning into my phone to announce, "The Greenway is happening whether you signed or not." I said nothing.
I just made sure the little red light was on, because a woman who tells you the theft is happening, regardless of your consent, has just described the crime for you, in her own voice, for free. That night I stopped reacting and started reading, which is where a surveyor becomes dangerous. I pulled the plat amendment from the county recorder, and it was real, recorded, official-looking, a replat carving a public greenway easement across the back of every lot on my street. But a replat that takes a slice of private land requires the joinder and consent of the affected owners, their actual signatures, notarized, attached as exhibits. So I pulled the consent exhibits, and I laid them next to the county's owner roll, and the whole thing came apart in my hands. One of the consenting owners was a man named Theo Petrakis, who had signed away a strip of his backyard in a firm, confident hand. The trouble was that Theo Petrakis had sold his house and moved to his daughter's place 2 states away more than a year before the date on that signature. A dead quiet backyard, belonging to a man who wasn't there, had consented to its own removal. And once I saw one forgery, I saw the pattern. Half the consents were signed in hands that didn't match anything on file, and the notary who'd supposedly witnessed them had a commission number that, per the Secretary of State's own records, wasn't active until months after the date stamped on the page. This was not a board that had cut a procedural corner. This was a land grab welded together out of forged signatures. And it wasn't just my yard. It was the whole streets. The association's response to a man quietly pulling certified copies was to get louder, because loud is the only volume they have. They recorded a lien against my parcel. They sent the Trail Patrol back a 3rd time. They ran a paragraph in the Hollow Creek newsletter describing me as one bitter man blocking a beautiful amenity for families, which was a bold thing to print about the guy whose oaks were lying in a pile. But by then, Derek Fall, the manager from Cornerstone Community Management who had actually prepared the amendment, had started to sweat, because I'd sent him a short, polite letter noting that preparing and recording forged owner consents is not a board problem. It's a personal felony, and that he, Derek, was the name on the filing. He called me at 7 the next morning. He did not want to talk about trails. He wanted to talk about the fact that he had emails, that Gwen Tolliver and the board attorney Paul Renz had told him to handle the consents and not overthink the signatures, and that there was a list, an internal spreadsheet of every parcel the Greenway was quietly slicing. I told him to keep all of it somewhere safe. He told me he already had 3 copies, which is how I knew Derek was going to be just fine and Gwen was not. They made one more run at it before the courthouse opened, and that night is the one the street still talks about. Word had spread by then, because I'd walked my geotagged photos and the Petrakis forgery door to door. So when the contractor tried a 9 o'clock push to grade the last stretch under work lights before any judge could act, he didn't find one man on a porch. He found 6 of us standing on the property line with our phones up. Gwen called it in as a mob threatening workers. I called it in, 30 seconds later, as unpermitted night excavation and criminal trespass. And I read the deputy the parcel numbers straight off the plat while she was still describing us as a riot. Nobody threw a punch because I'd told every neighbor the same thing I tell myself. The instant you put a hand on someone, you hand them the headline. So we just stood there, a wall of witnesses, and filmed a Bobcat idling in the dark it had no right to be in, until the deputy told the foreman that grading contested private land at night was an excellent way to spend a night in a cell, and the machine backed off the line for the last time. 2 dueling calls to 911. One of them true, both of them permanent. Now I had the map of the whole thing. And here is where most people expect me to say I filed a lawsuit and waited a year for a verdict behind closed doors. I did file. But these people had torn up my land at dawn and printed my name in a newsletter as the villain, and a debt that public does not get paid in a quiet courtroom 18 months later. So I moved fast, and I moved where it hurt. I filed for a temporary restraining order and a claim to quiet title, and I built the emergency motion around the one thing a judge can't argue with: my own geotagged photos and field notes, a precise timeline proving they had graded my land days before the amendment's own effective date, which meant they hadn't just stolen the land, they'd bulldozed it before their own forged paper even pretended to authorize it. The judge read the timeline and the consent exhibits and signed the order that afternoon. And then I did the part I'd been looking forward to. I drove out to where the Bobcats were roaring through my neighbor's fence line, with a sheriff's deputy following me and a certified copy of the restraining order in my hand, and I watched the machines choke and die one by one as the deputy walked the order down the line. There is a particular silence that follows a diesel engine when a court has just switched it off, and I stood in it and enjoyed it like a cold drink. Here is where Gwen did me the last, largest favor, because she still thought she was winning. The board scheduled a public hearing before the County Planning Commission to ratify the Greenway after the fact, and, in the same breath, to push a special assessment on the members to pay for legal defense of the trail, which meant every affected owner would be in one room on a known night. Before I opened a single exhibit, I did the thing I most wanted on the record. I stood up and I offered them the way out loud, in front of 40 of their own neighbors and a row of phones. I said, plainly, that I didn't want anyone's project dead out of spite. Rescind the amendment, restore the yards you tore up, and put the trail to an honest vote with real, signed consents, and I would walk away tonight, and so would the lawyers. It was the lawful exit, the cheap exit, the one that let everyone keep their dignity, and I held it open with a straight face. Gwen Tolliver looked at me the way she'd look at a weed in her median and said, into a live microphone, "This board does not need one homeowner's permission to improve this community." There it was, the whole thing in a sentence, on camera. Not a misunderstanding, a choice. She'd just told a room full of people whose signatures she'd forged that their permission was an inconvenience she intended to keep ignoring. So I gave them the rest. I put the recorded amendment on the screen, and beside it, Theo Petrakis' consent, and I asked the room how a man who'd moved away 14 months earlier had signed his backyard away last spring. I put up the notary's commission record, showing she hadn't been a notary on the day she'd sworn she was. I put up my geotagged timeline, proving the demolition ran before the paper's own effective date. I played the foreman saying, "We were just sent here," and Gwen saying, "Whether you signed or not." And then I put up the county's 911 call log, the whole ugly timeline of it. Every false report the board had phoned in on me, and every legitimate crime I'd reported on them. A coordinated campaign of harassment written in the dispatcher's own timestamps. Then Derek Fall stood up, on his own, and told the room that the board had directed him to manufacture the consents, and that the Greenway grant application the board had filed with the state had certified in writing that all affected owners consent, which meant the forgery hadn't just been recorded at the county, it had been mailed to a state agency for money. You could hear the folding chairs. Somebody near the front said, "Forgery." Somebody else said, "District Attorney." A motion to recall the entire board was on the floor before Gwen Tolliver got her face back under control. And this time, when a sheriff's deputy walked into a Hollow Creek meeting, he wasn't there for me. It came apart the way rotten framing always does once you pull the first stud. The quiet title action voided the plat amendment not just for my lot, but for every parcel on that forged consent list. And the land went back to all 11 of us, my neighbors getting their backyards returned by a court order they hadn't even known to ask for. The forged consents and the grant certification went to the Benton County District Attorney as a forgery and fraud referral aimed at Gwen Tolliver and Paul Renz personally. And a referral like that does not care about a resignation. The board discovered it was personally liable for the demolition because intentional destruction of a neighbor's property is the one thing an association's insurance policy will not touch. And when the arborist's valuation of 3 felled century oaks came in under the state's timber trespass statute, which trebles the damages for cutting what isn't yours, the number stopped being a fine and started being a mortgage. Cornerstone Community Management lost the Hollow Creek contract within the month because a management company is only worth its fee until its manager is a witness. Gwen and her block resigned before the recall could formally remove them. To spend time with family, the traditional local dialect for saw it coming. My fence got rebuilt on the board's dime, and I put 3 new oak saplings in the ground where the old ones had stood, paid for by the people who'd cut them. They won't shade my porch in my lifetime, but they'll outlast the trail that was there for exactly 9 days, and I find that I can live with the trade. Author's note: stepping in as the guy behind the channel for a second, because this one is a masterclass in how a board turns a bad idea into a felony. Gwen Tolliver's mistake wasn't wanting a greenway. It was believing that a vote, a vest, and a clipboard added up to authority over land a deed says isn't hers. The moment she needed forged signatures to make the project legal, the project was already a crime. The fake consents weren't a shortcut, they were the load-bearing wall. And she left the evidence everywhere a person could look. A backyard signed by a man who'd moved 2 states away. A notary who wasn't one yet. A demolition that ran before her own paper's effective date. And a 911 log that turned her harassment into a timeline. She even chose the crime out loud, on camera, when a neighbor held the lawful door open and she refused to walk through it. Takeaways. Pull your plat and deed at the county before you argue with anyone, because a replat needs your signed consent and they can't invent it legally. Film everything and let the timestamps fight for you. And offer the reasonable deal in public. A refusal in front of witnesses is the best evidence you'll ever collect for free. Question for you. If you woke up to a machine cutting a community trail through your own backyard, could you keep your hands in your pockets and let the paperwork win? Or would you have given them the scene they were begging for? Tell me below.